Hi there. Thanks for tuning into another episode of Tinnitist TV. Today, I'm talking to Mike Boguski about his new album. It's not his first rodeo, certainly not his main one. That honor, of course, goes to Blue Rodeo. Boguski has played piano and organ for the Canadian country rock legend since 2008. But if you're expecting some sort of honky-tonk fare on his latest solo release, Goodbye to Yesterday, Here's to Tomorrow, well, you're in for a surprise. Its half dozen tracks find the restlessly creative musician wading into jazz, classic pop rock, funk, electronica, and more with the help of an all-star cast that includes members of Cowboy Junkies, some of his Blue Rodeo bandmates, and others. Shortly before the album arrived and he headed out back on the road, Boguski got on Zoom to talk about his day job, recording in his mom's basement, his love of 70s rock, and much, much more. Enjoy.
All right, now it's real. See, in the studio, one of the old tricks that a producer does is he secretly puts the record button on so that,
Sure, sure. Just to
the
catch
musicians are
the
going to be,
magic.
yeah, or like Neil Young would have everybody having a smoke and talking, and then he would just run to the recording booth and start. Travis Good told me the story about when Neil and Garth were at the Lake Peter J. Moore studio. Peter's a great old friend of mine who I am still processing his not being with us, but he told us that story about when Garth was doing this sort of compilation album of band tunes with Blue Rodeo and Bruce Coburn. A lot of people recorded on it, but that was the story that they were all sitting at Peter's just shooting the breeze, and then Neil just got up and went, and then it was game on, and that was the take they got. I think they did Wheels on Fire. So.
Yeah, well, I mean that's you hear that all the time where it's, something just gets caught on the tape and the
Mm.
run through becomes the single, you
Well,
know.
we had a good take there about 20 seconds ago. We could try to revisit it.
So, we're here today, obviously, to talk about your new solo stuff. I mean, obviously, you are known, I think, best known for being in Blue Rodeo for 15 years. But I
16
find it,
now. I'm at
yeah,
16th.
16. All right. So, but I find it interesting that I think for a lot of people who know you primarily from that gig, if they heard what you do in your other, in the other side of your musical life, they would be surprised because it's quite a there's quite a gap between the two areas, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Totally. I mean, I'm not a singer-songwriter. Maybe one day I will be because I've spent my whole career working with singer-songwriters, and I'm currently got a gig with, in my opinion, two of the best in Canada. So I I'm absorbing how singer-songwriters approach things in everything I do, but I'm still primarily an instrumentalist, right? Like I'm not ready to start putting my voice to a microphone, right? So I used to do a lot of covers, interpretations of other people's music, and then I really got to this point where I said, like I want to put my original stuff out there. I really want to. My Spotify and my streaming, you pay a lot of money when you cover somebody's material, right? Like they charge you a lot of licensing, and the streaming situation, as you know, for independent artists is horrendous, right? So it's like I was just losing money having, like, I did an album of Blue Rodeo material a few years back on my album Detour. I did this charity album for my friend John Brandom, who was a tech over in England who worked for Suede and the Pretenders. He had a big stroke, and so I sort of did this jazz version of one of their albums to raise money for him. But then, like, I just looked at all my accounting over the course of the years, and I'm like, I'm paying all this money in licensing and I'm making nothing. So it's a losing. It's just sort of like a losing game for an instrumentalist to have covers of other people's music on your stream. So I basically told my admin uh, at my little label to just take off everything that's not mine, and I'm going to reset with this album of like only Michael Boguski original stuff will be up there. And so, yeah, but to your point, you had mentioned about you feel that there's a divide between sort of being known for Blue Rodeo, but I don't see that as much because a lot of what I do on the keyboards with Blue Rodeo, I inherited an aesthetic that really started with Bobby Wiseman when he was the original keyboard player in Blue Rodeo. Jim and Greg were really wanting to have a freewheeling improvisatory kind of guy. They were very influenced by NRBQ and Terry Adams, right? Like who kind of, if you watch Terry, he does a lot of off the fly stuff, right? And I think Jim and Greg were like, that's super cool. We're putting a band together. We want a guy who will do that. And I think Bobby was a student of improvisation with the same teacher I studied with at York, Casey Soko. And so songs like Diamond Mine and a lot of that stuff, Greg wanted Bobby to, and Jim did too, both to be free and open with sections of songs. And so I kind of do, obviously I'm a very different player than Bobby, but we have new tunes, like we've resurrected tunes like Disappear, for example, where there's a big, 3 or 4 minute piano intro, coda, where I don't know what I'm playing. It's free improv, like in the sense that I'm just sort of finding my way back to the band, or Diamond Mine, or whatever. So yeah, that kind of improvised approach to playing parts is very much part of Blue Rodeo. And so, a lot of the material on this new album that I've put out it comes from my background in improvisation. A few years back, Michael Tinnitist helped me make a really cool album called Blues for the Penitent, which was, I had just started learning about free improv. And again, like, I just want to make a distinction to the listeners that, like, when you talk about jazz improvisation, so if you're talking about like a 32 bar standard or a blues, yes, in the sense that, like, it's not a notated melody, they are improvising, but really the chord changes, like on a blues or whatever, they're kind of goalposts that are really pointing out, play this, and if you don't play those notes, you're going to sound like you don't know what you're doing, right? But in free improvisation, which is sort of like late John Coltrane, Cecil Taylor, some Keith Jarrett, stuff that came out in the 60s and on, it really was free. Like, you sat at a piano and you didn't know what you were going to play, and you just started creating clusters of ideas and developing them. And it sounds like, oh, well, that's just, anybody can do that. Like, it's very hard. I remember my wife came to one of my first free improvised concerts, and she's so awesome. She's like, yeah, I don't know, that one was pretty didn't really work. And it's hard. There is a technique to it. There's a lot of stuff that you have to let go of, and then there's stuff you got to focus on. And so I did this album with Mike Timmons called Blues for the Penitent. And then after I finished doing that, I said to Mike, I want to continue with this sort of idea. Let's contain it a bit. So it's not going to be fully free, but there'll be free sections. So I brought in Basil Donovan from Blue Rodeo. I brought in Cleve Anderson, who I work with quite a bit. Sometimes I see Cleve more than I see the band. We're always playing shows. We've got an organ trio. We play together in the John Bora band. So I brought him in, and we cut these tracks, and they were great. It was really successful. And I just sort of shelved them, and I didn't really do anything. And then, like I mentioned to you earlier, when I came to this sort of point of realization that, having covers up on my streams wasn't really doing anything for me, I had these 2 tunes. I'm like, I should really re-release those. And then I brought in my new quartet, the Michael Boguski quartet. I have some exceptional musicians who are more known in the jazz world, like Ethan Ardelli on drums, and Mike Downs, and Andy Ballantyne, and I cut a bunch of stuff. And the thing about Mike, see, Mike plays with everybody. He's a top bass player, but he loves to play electric with me. I don't want him to play upright, because I'm really trying to sort of represent the rock aesthetic. It's trying to really represent, what is the aesthetic of rock music, combined with some improvisation into really a concentrated instrumental statement. And that's what this album is, of original material.
Well, I think, yeah, you've nailed it, definitely. I mean, to me, when I was first listening to it, the 70s style vibe kind of kept popping into my head. I mean, Goodbye to Yesterday, to me, at least to my untrained ear, has a certain almost Elton Johnish, early Billy Joel, maybe even a bit of Springsteen in there, just that sort of
vibe. it's funny you mentioned that, because my very first album with Blue Rodeo, the first review I ever read, and never read your own reviews, it's the worst, it can destroy you as an artist. But somebody said, oh, there's a tumbleweed connection to his piano playing. And I wasn't an Elton John fan. I don't know what it's talking about. My piano playing sounds like a tumbleweed. Like, I was so ignorant, right? And then I realized somebody's like, no, he's paying you a big compliment. He's saying that your piano sounds like Elton John. So like Elton, you know, he comes from that, like Leon Russell, Elton John. Like, there's a whole school of piano players, Roy Bittan, that sort of, you know, Springsteen's player, that encapsulate that rock aesthetic. And, you know, there is an ignorant hierarchy out there in the working musician world, that like the jazz piano players sits at the top because it's such an esoteric, difficult art form, and everybody else is sort of beneath them. But that's not the case. Like, there's great musicianship required to execute rock and roll piano the way it's supposed to be played. And I'll give you an example of this. You can listen to 100 different artists do Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire, right?
Yeah.
And they all play it note perfect. But like right before he died, I think he was like 80 something, he still has a way of playing those very elementary licks in such an idiosyncratic way that's only Jerry Lee, right? You realize that like there's a whole aesthetic to rock and roll piano. You can go very deep into it. You know?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that kind of stuck out for me with a lot of these songs is despite the fact they're all instrumentals, they're very lyric in terms of some of the melodies are very strong, where you're almost waiting for a vocalist to come in at times, you know?
But this is the product of working with singer-songwriters for the last 16 years. Like, you know, Jim and Greg have their craft so dialed in, right? They're so, you know, I love the Beatles ever since I was a little boy, right? My parents had tons of Beatles records. So I was like, this is like cooler than being in a Beatles cover band is playing in Blue Rodeo, because they're so influenced by the Beatles, right? But we're making original music, right? And so I study the Beatles. I listen to the Beatles intensely. I listen to how Jim and Greg combine their voices, how, you know, their verse chorus structure, when they have instrumental, like it's, you know, you really, you know, the Blue Rodeo and the Beatles are very, very closely linked.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they've had that you know, Cuddy, Keeler, Lennon, McCartney comparison going on for years. So you feel they've kind of changed the way that you approach songwriting over the
yeah
time?
Well, like even when I'm writing a piece of music that's instrumental, I'm approaching it as if there's a singer singing it. I'm trying to structure those melodies, like you said, like they could be sung, you know? Maybe
do you feel that, do you think that you've had an impact on the way they write?
No, I think a songwriter always, you know, is describing a landscape with words and melody and chords, and like everything, they come to us, you know, myself, Jimmy Boguski, Glenn, Colin, and Basil, to sort of further articulate the landscape that their words are trying to describe, and that's the beauty of what the band does. And the band is very colorful right now. I mean, Blue Rodeo has some exceptional musicians playing. You know, Colin Cripps is, you know, he's well known. I mean, Jimmy Bosco is, and the two of them together. You know, it's a really great time to watch Blue Rodeo right now, and everybody thinks, oh yeah, Blue Rodeo will always be back in my hometown, but you know, like, you never know what's around. Like, you know, things change quickly. You know, who would have thought, you know, Lord Downey would have passed? Who would have thought, you know, so many people are. So I just always say to people out there, you know, come see Blue Rodeo now. If you've never seen Blue Rodeo, come check it out. It's really something right now. The band is just fire. You know?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, as you said, it's a bunch of great musicians all getting to work together. It seems to me that it's just the ultimate gig position. I mean, there aren't many bands that I can think of in Canada who have the longevity and are still as creatively and commercially viable as you guys are. You know, there are some bands that have been around that long, but they're kind of relegated to the casino circuit, or they haven't made a good album in forever, and they're just, you know, recreating the hits. But you guys are still out there, you know, doing something you know, it's not just going out and phoning in the show, right?
Well, and I think that comes from, you know, the history of Blue Rodeo, and especially like Jim and Greg. They never really looked at it as, oh, this is what we're going to do for our living. And, you know, like they all had day jobs, right? Up until like Diamond Mine. Like like I realize that now, that like their love of songwriting and melody writing and doing what they do is pure. And the career that came out of their commitment to their vocation was a consequence of their love of their craft, right? And I see that has what has sustained a band like Blue Rodeo, to your point, going and continuing forward with making new albums, because there's such an unadulterated pure love of their craft still there, where I think some bands like, oh, I want to be rock stars, or I want to do that, and then maybe you get lucky, you write a few songs, but in order to sustain it and continue to develop it, it cannot be just coming from oh, I want to do this for a living and I want to be famous, and
Right. No, obviously
you got a limited run if that's what your inspiration is. But I can tell you that Jim and Greg are very much, and everybody in that band, not just, the whole band, are there for the right reasons. We've finally got a group of people that are all joined together by their love of music, because it's hard.
I would imagine that
we just did 2 gigs.
Yeah.
We had to
I also think that just on a practical level, it's a great gig. I mean, you guys, you don't work overly hard. You have a nice, you have a pretty decent tour schedule. You're not out there playing 40 shows over the summer or anything like this.
Well, our summers get busy. Like we concentrate our work into specific times of the year, and then yes, to your point, we have the time off after. But summer is,
for a musician, it's got to be like the next best thing to getting appointed to the Senate or something. It's like, it's just a great gig to have, I would think.
It is a great gig to have, but again, like back to what I was saying earlier, like 16 years of doing it, like when your first year doing it, your second year, oh wow, but like eventually, the sacrifice that your personal life takes, the family members you have to leave behind, the early lobby calls, the being on a tour bus, the taking prop planes up to the northern parts of the country, it will quickly push you to a point of self-reflection in terms of your vocation. Is this really what I want to do? Right. Because if you're not really committed, you won't last. You know what I mean? Like I remember I was I gave a very brief lecture at York University a couple years ago, and I remember the young kid was like, well, I can't do that. I want to get married and I want to have a job that's security and all that. And like, so maybe just do it for a hobby, because if you really want to do this as a full-time career, it's a big sacrifice.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there's sacrifices to be made. So going back to this album, to your album, to Here's to Tomorrow, Goodbye to Yesterday. Talking about the improvisational aspects of this, so how much rehearsing with the band are you doing before these recordings? Is it literally bringing the guys in and going, okay, here's how this kind of goes, and roll the tape and let's see what we get? Or are you spending time figuring out the plot line of the songs beforehand?
Bare minimum.
Yeah.
So like some of those tunes I'd introduced in shows I played with Ethan and Mike, but Lauren Lofsky was a last minute addition. So Terry Brown, like, first of all, to work with him on this was an absolute dream. I had worked very closely for most of my solo discography with Peter J. Moore. I worked on many other artists' albums with Peter, and so sadly he passed, and it was really hard. He was gone. So I saw Terry at Peter's memorial, and actually, no, sorry, I had connected with Terry earlier because I had done an album Detour, and Peter and I had a very unorthodox idea for that album, which was to pan the drums and the bass onto one side of the speaker and the piano on the other, to have that old school Blue Note sound, right? And I kind of sent the mix. I had asked Peter, I'm like, hey, can you give me Terry? Like, I just introduced me to Terry by email, and I was such a big fan of everything Terry had done. I really like the stuff he did with like Dr. Music in the 70s. It was some of the best stuff around for the kind of music I was just like, no, this guy gets it. And of course, Rush and the early Blue Rodeo and everything else. So, I said, Terry, can you listen to this mix and tell me if you think this is out of control or not? And he gave me some good feedback. So then back, Peter then passed away. I saw Terry again at the memorial. And I said, Terry, I've got this album that Peter was going to help me finish, and would you consider it? And Terry's like top of the food chain. Like he's as big as it gets. And he said, well, I'll listen to your mixes and we'll go from there. And he listened to Here's to Tomorrow and Goodbye to Yesterday, and he liked it. And so he agreed to help with that. So I think what was your original question was how much I mapped out the improvisation. Yeah, I didn't map it. Oh, Laura Mosky, right. So Terry gave me some feedback. He goes, there's not a lot of meat on these bones. Like, because originally I was very much wanting the aesthetic of the album to be like Keith Jarrett's, what was that album that Jarrett did with the Gaborik, the Norwegian horn player. It's escaping me right now, the name of it. I can see the album cover.
One of the ECM ones?
Yeah, it's an early ECM one with the European Quartet.
Okay.
He did that tune that Steely Dan stole, and then they had to give Jarrett a writer's credit. Anyway, that was my sort of vision, was to just have piano, bass, upright bass, drums, and horn. And I gave that mix to Terry, and he was like, you know what, there's not a lot of meat on this. So I then added organ and started adding synthesizers. And then he thought like a guitar would be a good thing to add. So I think I didn't want to get a guitar player from Blue Rodeo, because I was trying to do something that was a little different than this. So, I mean, I could have asked Colin or Jimmy, who are both amazing, but I think I ended up asking Kevin Bright, and he wasn't available. So I asked Mike, I said, like, who would you recommend? He's like, oh, you should ask Lauren, who, was Oscar Peterson's last guitar player. Right. Played with Chet Baker, like not played with, but like was his guy. Like, he's exceptional. He's like amazing. And so he came into the studio, and I thought, oh, this big jazz cat's gonna, impose his jazz, but he wasn't like that at all. He was totally like deferential. I said, can you play something like George Harrison would? And he was like, no problem. And he was like telling me how much he loves the Byrds, and like he even like was like, oh yeah, Johnny Marr, the Smiths. Like, this guy's hip. He really understands rock and roll, and yet brought his voice, his jazz voice to it. So yeah, we had that all, and then Terry mixed it all. But like, I didn't give them a lot of direction. It was basically just like kind of blue chord charts, where it was like, we're in this mode, we're just going to have an open solo, you're going to start us. Like, I did, yeah. So it was pretty open, pretty free. And that tune December was a single take. We got it in one take. I
was going to ask, because a lot of these seem like they could be, very much first take kind of, but it all hangs together. It doesn't feel chaotic in any sense. The other thing that I guess I was kind of surprised by a little bit is that I don't, just listening to it casually, you don't think of it as a piano album, No,
like, and that's what I intended to do. That I'm so happy you said that, because really, I was trying to not make this a piano album. I had done a piano album, Blues for the Penitent. It was a solo improvised piano album, which I'll be re-releasing and re-recording shortly. But this album, I really wanted it to be not a piano album. And I think I play a lot of Fender Rhodes piano on it. I play some Yamaha CP80. There's only really one tune that's a piano tune, which is Memorials, which is the one.
And that's got the undercurrent. I mean, that's got the synth undercurrent to me. That
has that Brian Eno pad underneath it.
I was going to go Vangelis, but yeah, it's got that.
Vangelis, Brian Eno, that whole thing. Yeah. It's funny because I tracked that. This is a bit of a gear nerd out here. I tracked that on my piano in my studio, and Tim Vesley mixed it. And I also recorded it with a Roland JV1000, which is like an old synth from the 90s. I had quickly, a friend of mine who lives near my cottage up near Algonquin had lost his wife, and he had asked me to play a memorial for her. And I remember just going, I can't fit my keyboard in the car. I'll just grab this old JV1000, and I recorded a version. And my wife was like, you need to add another section. So she was helping me. She's not musical, but she's like, you need to add more. There's not enough there. So I started, and I recorded it anyway. So when it came time to doing this album, at the last minute, I went to Noah Mintz and I said, use the demo from the JV1000, not the one with all the mics and $1,000 preamps. Like, so what you're hearing is like this old 90s keyboard. Like, that's not even a real piano. To let the cat out of the bag.
Yeah. It works. Do you have a ton of gear? Are you a guy who's got like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to have too much gear. And then I built a studio in my mom's basement, because my mom is, she's getting older, and I'd like to kill two birds with one stone. I'd visit my mom, and then I'd like record. And I have all these like, you know, Juno winners and luminaries coming to my mom's house, and she'd like make everybody dinner and we'd record. It was very cool. But then
Very.
eventually I had to, I could never afford to keep that going. You know, sad to say, but you know, if my mother, when my mother were to pass away, eventually, like she lives in a rather large home, so it was like I said, this little tiny space came up across the road from my apartment. I said, I think I'm gonna transfer everything over there. So it's small, and once I moved over there, I started getting rid of a lot of gear. So really, my studio is very bare bones. It's like it's got a piano, a couple pianos, a couple synths, an organ, a Hammond. It's not a Hammond organ. I have a Korg BX3 and a Leslie, and a couple tape machines. That's it.
Well, that's okay. I mean, that can be freeing in its own way, you know.
It is, because I don't do full band recordings there. So artists will often come into the studio with bed tracks that they've already recorded, and they'll bring the producer into my studio. And then, you know, I'll just overdub like for the day, like, what do you want on this? Oh, you want some organ? Okay, let's do some organ. Oh, you want a mini Moog? Okay, let's do that. Oh, you want some, you know, Fender Rhodes. And so like I just did an album like that with Don Kerr and another colleague of mine, Paul Pfister, who used to be in the Beauties with me, and Steve Sinnix. Lots of people are just sending me remote tracks just for keyboard. So yeah, it's never going to be a full recording studio. It's just a keyboard overdub room.
You know, you seem to have, you know, I just did an album with this guy. I just did this.
Yeah,
I just,
yeah.
you're, is that, I mean, how much of that is love of music, wanting to keep busy, getting all kinds of offers and not wanting to say no? How much of that is having the maximum number of revenue streams available as an independent musician?
I've always had like a strong work ethic instilled in me since I was young, you know, so I just figure like, you know, work is work. It's like Michael Caine when he was getting the Academy Award for Hannah and her sisters, and he's like, I got to start filming Jaws 3D. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
he
yeah.
would never turn down work because you know, when you come from a background where like, you know, to not work is like sin, right? So I feel guilty. Like, first of all, like, you know, the artists I work with, I all love them. I love their music. So it's
Yeah,
like, it
well, that's
sounds
what I
great.
think.
But like, I just feel guilty if I'm like, I don't want to sit around all day and do nothing. If I could, you know, hey, well, I can record some keyboards and get paid for it. Like, you know, let's do another gig. I mean, I try to balance my work schedule and my personal schedule as best as I can. When I was young, I would do everything. I would just constantly, and that's how you have to be to get a name and break in. But, you know, now I'm able to be a little bit more selective with,
That's good. Yeah, I looking up some of your stuff on the internet, and I was looking on YouTube, and I was kind of I was pleased to see that there are a lot of clips that people post of a Blue Rodeo show, and they'll just like post your solo out of a song, or
yeah.
a song where you've got kind of a spotlight. That's a really nice compliment to have paid
Well,
to you.
it really is a nice compliment. And for me, you see, like Jim and Greg carved those spaces out, right? So if I wasn't able to do that, to deliver that statement, they wouldn't have the space. Like, you know, like, you know, they can put the mute button on the keyboard channel like that. You know what I mean? And they don't. They sort of like what I do. So
Yeah.
I like what they do. I think what they do is amazing. And so I try to express my affection for their craft through my craft, you know.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of what I was asking earlier, and it's probably a better question to ask one of them. But, you know, I've talked to other songwriters who, like a Jeff Tweedy or somebody, when he's got a band that is, you know, kind of very in a similar situation where you've got all these great players, and they'll say that it changes the way they write because they know that, okay, I can either write a part for Mike that, you know, that I know he can take to a different place, or leave that space for him. You know what I mean?
Mm,
It
yeah.
becomes a color in the palette that they know they can use in different ways. But again, that's probably something that's a better question for them.
Right.
And I noticed that both you and Jim have solo albums coming out this summer,
Yeah.
which is the same as last time he had a solo album was 2019, and you also did one that. Is
Yeah.
that something that is that just coincidence, or is that something you kind of actively coordinate to go, oh, okay, you've got one, I can put mine out?
Total coincidence.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we're just sort of both subconsciously aware of the Blue Rodeo tour schedule, and I think
Sure.
you know, yeah, you know, probably that's what's going on. I mean, I know he's going on the road in September, October, November with his band, and I'm going to try to line up some work for my stuff. So, yeah,
Right.
you know, Jim and I are similar that way. we both like to work. You know, we don't like to take
Yes, he's
breaks.
definitely. I mean, I get the sense, having talked to Greg, obviously he likes to keep busy too, but he's more of a Neil Youngish, get up in the morning and something will take his attention and he'll follow that trail perhaps. Whereas Cuddy seems to be a guy with a plan and a diary and a
Greg works just as hard as Jim. He just works in different ways. So like
yeah, yeah.
he'll spend all day, for example, writing a tune. Like they have different songwriting processes. Like I know like Jim is like Ron Sexsmith or like a lot of people. He can just sit down and say, okay, I'm taking these 10 days to write an album and then write it. Whereas like Greg is more like he'll just write when he feels inspired all day and then come up with a beautiful tune like Hasn't Hit Me or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
but like he, I know he spends a lot of his day songwriting. It's just it's a different way than say
Yeah.
Jim, who's like playing more live shows. It's probably, harder for Greg because he has he still has certain issues with hearing and hearing certain frequencies, so he has to be careful with how much he can be on stage, and whereas Jim could probably get away with being on stage more. But definitely Greg's always writing. I know he has like tons of songs written on, material that nobody's heard yet, but he just keeps writing, just doesn't stop.
What about you? Are you always writing too?
No, I am now really disciplined with practicing, and practicing in a different way though. It's like I said, I studied with this very revolutionary teacher named Casey Sokol a few years back at York, and he has a certain pedagogy which I still subscribe to and have as part of my daily practicing. And sometimes out of the practicing comes ideas which I want to develop. But I am sort of going to take a little bit of a break now with this album, like with the exception of re-recording Blues for the Penitent, which is a fully free improvised album. So when I come up with my new version, it's not going to be the same as.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you re-record an improvised?
Yeah, exactly. So I sold out of the original, and I was going to repress it, and then I just started tinkering with this very cool 1/4-inch stereo tape machine I found. And I thought, because a 1/4-inch stereo tape machine is usually what you use to mix down like an 8-track 1/2-inch or whatever, or 2-inch. But I thought, why don't I just connect all my instruments and mics and everything in my studio to one mixer going straight to 1/4-inch and just press record and like do a whole electric free improvisation where I'm playing, synths and everything and just capturing it. And so that'll be the plan for the next album that'll be coming out soon for me.
And I mean, are you looking further ahead than that as well? Do you have sort of like a checklist of, and then I want to do this, and then I want to do that album, and then I want to do this? Or
I'm
do you
gonna do
kind of let
that.
things come?
I did this very cool because like I'm really into fundraising and activism. Like it's through music, right? Like I had a very successful project a few years back with the Cold Manitoba project. We raised over 200,000 for the Addictions Council in Manitoba. And then I started doing fundraising for Ukraine, and then I started doing fundraising for John. And when I originally was doing my fundraisers, I would do the material like you hear on the new album or Blues for the Penitent. It's a limited audience that gets it, right? And so not a lot of people were coming out, and that's okay, I get it. And then I stumbled on this idea of doing 100 years of popular music in 2 hours. So I looked at my whole repertoire of tunes, and I noticed that they go from the 1920s right up to the 2020s, right? So like I do 2 hours. I start with Cole Porter. I think I start with what is this thing called Love, and I end with like Little Wayne or something. Like it's quite a gamut, right?
Obviously.
And I just did it because I wanted more people coming to shows to enjoy, and it was hugely successful. Then I went to Vegas and I started like learning about Liberace and started taking notes on how he did his show. Like then I went full tilt. Like I have a sequin jacket, I've got the lights, I've got the microphone, and it became so much fun interacting with the audience and teaching them about pop music. And this thing became very successful. So that's sort of what I use when I want to do a bigger show and make money for whatever the cause I'm supporting at that time. So I have 2 shows. I have that show, and then I have the show which is really like what you're hearing on this album now, the more my stuff. Yeah.
How many songs do you think that you know off the top of your
Oh my
head?
God. Well, I don't know. I know 100 years worth in 2 hours to do the math.
Well, exactly. And then I bet that doesn't even scratch the surface,
But it's
really.
again, I'm looking at that. I love that you have that David Bowie and that Iggy Pop poster behind you because I just feel like I'm in a safe place right now. You know what I mean? So when I did the 70s, I like John Cale, it was such a, for me, so in my brain because
Right.
he played with that Theater of Eternal song with Lamont Young and just droning away on dissonance, and like he was an early um, person to bring the free improv avant-garde into the pop, right?
Sure.
And my New Year's resolution was to listen to everything Cale ever did, and eventually I got to Crawl With Me by Art Bergman, and I reached out to Art, and I was like, "Oh man, I love this." He's like, "Cale ruined my guitars, you replaced them with synthesizers." Like he's still upset about that. But anyway, I when I do the 70s, I do some John Cale, I do some David Bowie, I do when I get to the 80s, I do the Smiths. When I did the 90s, I do Mark Lanigan.
Wow.
I really express the artists I love. Like I don't really like I don't really love I don't know, like I like Miles Davis, I like John Coltrane, I like all of
Sure.
those cats, but like it's not my world. You know what I mean? I didn't grow up in those
Right.
circumstances. I didn't grow up in that culture, which is so a part of what they were doing. Like
Mhm.
Horace Silver, civil rights, the horrible oppression that these people lived under. They were literally playing for psychological survival and peace of mind. So, and that is what that music is. That's what comes out of that music. So
Yeah.
to just take the notes void of the context, it's
Right.
it's not really the same thing. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I get to the point where I'm like, I'm going to express what I hear. Like I hear David Bowie, I hear Iggy Pop, I hear Johnny Marr, I hear all of those artists sort of speak to my disaffected middle class high school youth, moaning about things that I thought were so serious, which in the grand scheme of things were very minor compared
Yeah.
to the calamity of burden that so many other musicians have endured so that I could be part of this narrative, right?
Right.
So when I had that revelation, like, I still, obviously, like I do, so what I do all of the, you know, what do? I do a lot of Sonny Rollins and I do that, but it doesn't, I'm not able to connect with it in the way that the original artists were able to connect
Right.
with.
Yeah, but I mean, I think again, I hear that in the music on this album. It very much has. Yes, I think a lot of people will hear it and go, "Oh, that's jazz," and to a certain degree, they're right. But again, it's got that rock. It comes from a rock and a pop and
Yeah,
a very, it comes from that direction. Like I don't hear your playing and think of it in the same context that I would think of Chick Corea
yeah.
or Herbie Hancock with the
Yeah.
Davis group or anything. It's coming from a
Hmm.
different direction, and it's an honest direction because it's where you're coming from. You're not trying to
Yeah.
put
I only know what I know. Like,
yeah,
so
exactly.
with this album release that I have coming up this Friday at the Met Studios, 7 p.m. Please come if you can. It's going to be a great show. I'm opening the show with Blues for the Penitent, just me. Then I'm doing the album. And then I'm doing like basically just a handful of covers that I feel represent the influences that went into this album. So like, we start with Child Christmas in Wales by John Cale. And then I think um, we do a Smiths instrumental. Then we do Mark Lanigan. Then we do a Suede tune, He's Dead, the B-side from their first album. And then we end with A Day in the Life, this huge
Well,
orchestral.
there you go. Yeah.
It's beautiful, right? So come on, check it out. It's not going to be a jazz show. It's going to be a rock show. It's going to be a Mike Boguski show. It's
Well, if
guaranteed.
if there was an album from that era, then an album that you grew up listening to, maybe that you could get in the time machine and go back and play on. Can you think
Yeah.
of one? Something like that?
I think, like, honestly, that Mark Lanigan album, Whiskey for the Holy Ghost, which I came to much later, it's
Hmm.
funny because when Mark Lanigan was promoting that album because he was in the Screaming Trees, right? Like that was like considered a acoustic rootsy album compared to what grunge was, right? But to me, it's very rocking. Like,
Yeah.
that would have been an album I would have loved to have played on. You know, that's the one that comes to mind. You know,
Did you read his memoir?
My wife did. I have so many memoirs to get through, but I'm going to get to it. You know?
It is, and not surprisingly, it is dark. You know?
Yeah, we just saw the Afghan Wigs last night, and it was amazing. Like, it was so perfect. It was just loud sound at its best. We were right in the Danforth Music Hall front row, and I'm not an Afghan Wigs fan. My wife is, but boy, Greg Dooley really like won me over. He just was amazing. He was amazing. Because, you know, everybody's like, "Oh, rock is dead and it's all over and everybody's passed on." I felt like I was right in my high school consciousness last night with Greg's performance.
Yeah, exactly. No, I was just in Toronto a few weeks ago for the Hold Steady Weekender, and you know, talking about rock is dead. It's like, no, not at all. They come out, they do, you know,
they come out and they deliver
25, 26 songs, you know, 3 guitarists. It's all there.
I have developed this really cool close connection with Suede as a result of these fundraisers I've been doing for their, and like they're amazing people, all of them. You know, I went over to Camden and I did a show with John, who could still write lyrics and do spoken word, and we did 2 spoken word albums together. But their guitarist came out, Richard Oakes, Saul Galpern, who started Nude Records, who signed Suede. They were there, and I've become very close with those people over there, and they're cool. Like, I just sent a clip to Neil Codling about, I showed him an organ solo I did. I said, "Neil, I want to change this pedal. Should I use this or this?" And he's like, "Oh, stick with this one. It sounds way better." Like, it's cool with the internet how you can have relationships with people in a way you couldn't in the 90s, right? Like, you know, I wouldn't be able to do that. So there is some positives to this whole digital world we live in.
Oh, I got to take what you can get out of it. That's for sure. So, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't ask if we're inching towards a new Blue Rodeo album. It's been a few years. It would seem to be kind of like it's time for this to happen. Is there anything you can say about that?
No, nothing official on my end, but I would be surprised if after Jim has done his tour, if we weren't going to do something. I just think, like I mentioned earlier in the interview, Greg spends a lot of time writing tunes. Cuddy is just unbelievable in his ability to just sit there and go, "Okay, here, I'm going to write 10 tunes. There you go."
I mean, do you just kind of find out one day that they just, you know, you get an email and go, "Hey, we got 20 songs, come on down and learn them"?
I never take anything for granted.
Right.
I never do. I honestly never assume I'm going to be on the next Blue Rodeo album. I never assume I'm going to be on the next, like, you know, if it happens, it happens. And if it doesn't,
well, I mean, your position isn't precarious or anything like that. I mean, obviously things can change.
No, it's not precarious, but like, I don't, you know, like, I just would never, I would never like assume that, like, you know, maybe Jim and Greg want to do an album with a brass ensemble and call it a Blue Rodeo album, or maybe they want to, you know, they do. Not that would happen. I'm fairly confident I would be on the next Blue Rodeo album. But I'm just saying, like, you know what I mean? I think as a side person, I think this is a sort of a caveat to all the aspiring side people out there. You know, when you're a side person, you have to defer to the song, right? And if the song needs you, you're on the song. And if the song doesn't need you, then you're not on the song. And it's not an indictment or a verdict on your musicianship or your caliber of playing. It's just the song didn't need you on that one, you know. And so that's when I say, like, you know, I always assume I'm going to be on the next Blue Rodeo, but, you know, if not, then maybe, I don't know. But hopefully I am, because it's a lot of fun.
I suspect you will be, sir. Right, well, listen, thanks for your time today. I'll let you get on with your day, and thanks for
right on.
Album. It was a real treat because I honestly didn't know what to expect, and I kind of had preconceived notions, and then you took it in a different direction that was both surprising and, oh, this is, you know, better. It's going to sound awful for me to say better than I expected, but
yeah, well,
you know,
there you go. So there you go. Don't have preconceived notions. Just go into the studio with an open mind, and you say something, I say something, we improvise, and we create something unexpectedly beautiful. So there you go.
Yeah, exactly. All right, man. We'll see you somewhere down the road.
Yeah, hopefully at my show. See ya.
Cheers. Bye.